Is there a tension between kind of the left, the progressive wealth redistribution kind of ideas with the idea of building that's primarily sort of getting out of the way and letting the market get the job done?
Let's say two things on that. So, one, we think there's a real tension between equality, redistribution, and constricting the supply of specifically housing.
In this video, Ezra Klein schools Lex Fridman using facts on his own show. So Lex tries to open with what sounds like a thoughtful question about whether progressive redistribution just clashes with letting the market handle things. But Ezra just immediately flips it. He doesn't just answer, he shreds the entire framing. Instead of playing into some weak market versus redistribution narrative, Ezra just starts breaking down how housing crises are rooted in laws that protect the rich, not any so-called government overreach. And that's just the start. So yeah, make sure to watch till the end to see how Ezra Klein schools Lex Fridman using facts on his own show.
So housing, by the way, I would love to understand this. That's the big problem of our era.
Housing and energy, I think, are the two most significant that we focus on in the book, right? Housing and clean energy. We don't have enough housing, we don't have enough clean energy. I would add things to that. Public infrastructure. We don't really focus that much on education, but we could, and we could talk about that. Immigration is probably there for me too, and we talk about that a little bit in the book. And we do talk a lot about how to pull innovation forward from the future. But when you ask about sort of redistribution, I really think this is an important point because there's a great new paper by David Schleicher, and I'm so sorry because I'm forgetting his co-author. They're law professors, so when they talk about the victory of gentry law. We used to have a law that was very dynamic when it came to property and land. It was very different than how things were in Britain. And over time, sort of back half of the 20th century, we moved American law to be much more for what they call the gentry. We moved it much more towards protecting those who currently have things, right? And we do that through a million things, covenants and HOAs and all these sort of contracts we make people enter into so they can't even build on their own land. But one of the things that just happens when you constrict the supply of housing is that people who got in when the getting was good, it's a classic story in New York and LA and in SF. You bought a place in 1977 for $220,000 and now it's worth $2.7 million. And maybe you'll pass it on to your kids or you sell it. But the working class families can't afford to live there anymore. Right. So that's not even a question of redistribution. Sometimes what you need in order to create the possibilities for opportunity and mobility is enough supply of the thing. At the same time, we don't think like that redistribution is the problem here. I'm pro redistribution. I'm pro more redistribution than we currently do. But to give one example, the way these can be great days to go together, Derek tells in the book at some great length the story of Operation Warp Speed. And here you have in the mRNA vaccines, technology that was critically funded by public money, specifically DARPA at different points, then hastened, after COVID, government through Operation Warp Speed under Donald Trump, really tried to clear out regulatory cruft, move these things really fast. But the demand on the side of the public for having funded so much of this, for having made so much possible, was that when these vaccines hit, they were going to be free. Maybe the most important medical advance of that entire era. And it wasn't going to be like Ozempic, say, where it's, $15,000 for a year of doses, right? It wasn't going to be only available to the richest people at the beginning. We were going to try to give it to everybody, sorted by need to the best that we could, and it would be free. Now, you're not going to do that with everything, right? There are places for the price signal to actually function and where it can function to then bring on more supply later. And, there's all the Econ 101 stuff that we all know. But there are a lot of places where redistribution and supply increases go hand in hand.
So like, this moment just kinda shows the intellectual mismatch. Lex frames housing as the big problem, but it's vague, like he's fishing for something abstract. And then Ezra just, like, launches into a masterclass. He doesn't just agree, it's like he detonates the whole foundation of why we even have the housing crisis in the first place. Ezra goes deep on what he calls the gentry law, which is such a damning phrase. He's basically saying we used to have flexible, pro-growth land law, and now it's locked up by the wealthy, using contracts and HOAs to keep everything static. He's not just blaming lack of housing on red tape, he's saying the whole legal structure was re-engineered to protect the already rich. And yeah, that's a brutal truth people don't want to hear. And then he pivots, cleanly and smartly, into this banger of an example with Operation Warp Speed. He's saying, look, redistribution and efficiency aren't mutually exclusive. Public funding for vaccines was paired with stripped down regulatory hurdles and a commitment to universal access. That's how you blend the best of both models. Lex wanted to talk markets versus redistribution, and Ezra's just like, no, dude, you can do both if you're not lazy.
Another good example, I've done over the course of my career a huge amount of work on health insurance reform and universal health care. And let's say you got, Bernie Sanders had become president in 2016 and had swept in a huge Democratic majority, and they passed Bernie's single payer for all plan, which was, by the way, much more expansive than any existing single payer plan in the world, right? It covered much more than Canada's or the UK's or anybody else. If you had done that, what you would have needed immediately was a huge supply increase in healthcare, because you would have had a huge demand increase. What happens if you make healthcare free? People are going to use more of it. If you make insurance much more widespread, people are going to go to the doctor more often. Well, if you don't have enough doctors, you don't have enough nurses, you don't have enough surgeons, you need more. We constrict the supply of all those things using residency rules, using nursing rules, immigration rules, who can practice as a nurse practitioner, what can a nurse practitioner actually do. You have to be attentive to the supply side, even if what you're doing is aggressive redistribution. Now, there are places where these things don't conflict. Like, I'd like to see a much expanded child tax credit, and I don't think that has a big supply side implication one way or the other. But on a lot of the things we're talking about, even if what you want to do, and it is often what we want to do more redistribution, if you're redistributing some kind of thing that gives you access to a good or a service, you need to expand the good or the service. We do rental vouchers. Giving people rental vouchers in the San Francisco housing market, unless you build more housing, just creates something that our friends at the Niskanen Center call cost disease socialism, where you are increasing demand for good at which you've constricted supply. If you do that, you're just going to drive the price up. To some degree, that's at least part of the story of higher education. We give people Pell Grants, we give people all kinds of subsidies for higher ed, but we have not done nearly enough to increase supply or regulate the way in which colleges just then pocket part of that money. And so they're building these fancy gyms and they're competing with each other, but they're not actually increasing the supply of slots. It's certainly not the level we want them to. So there's a lot here where I think it scrambles traditional categories. You cannot do effective redistribution in ways that we would like to see them done, and many people on the left would like to see them done, if you're not taking supply of the thing that you're subsidizing seriously.
The housing problem we're talking about specifically, or most importantly, is in urban areas.
Yeah, this is something that we spent a lot of time thinking about for the book. There's a lot of land in the United States. And sometimes you'll hear people say something like, I've heard this a lot. Well, not everybody can live in San Francisco or Venice in Los Angeles or, Manhattan or Brooklyn or whatever. And fine, right? Not everybody can. That's true. The problem is that cities are engines of opportunity and economic dynamism. I mean, as you know better than we do, the frontier AI labs in the US, basically all of them outside of China, exist in 50 square miles in the Bay Area. There's not one in New York. There's not one in Dallas. There's not one in Chicago. There's not one in Austin. There's not one anywhere but in the Bay Area.
So Lex tossed out that little urban housing prompt, right? But Ezra just shuts it down. He's not playing Pundit here. He's straight up mapping how redistribution falls apart without structural reforms to supply. And the example he gives, Bernie's single payer plan. Dude says even if the left had won the biggest healthcare fight ever, it still would have failed unless we scaled up doctors, nurses, hospitals, and everything. Because you can't just make healthcare free and expect demand to rise without prepping supply. It's that simple and that smart. He's pointing out how liberal policy goals get sabotaged not by ideology, but by logistics nobody wants to fix. Then he name drops cost disease socialism. It's what happens when you give people vouchers or grants for things like housing or college without increasing the actual stuff they're buying. Prices spike, the rich skim off the top, and the poor still lose. He's not just preaching left-wing economics here. He's dissecting why even good intentions fall flat.
But the key thing is that there is huge spillover from these hyperdynamic industries, be it finance in New York, be it tech in San Francisco, be it culture in Los Angeles. you make a lot more money being a barber near Google than you do being a barber in, rural Arkansas. And this is the ancient pathway to mobility. People who are poor and work in the service sector, they move to richer areas where where the productivity is higher, and thus the sort of money spreads around. And if you look at American mobility and opportunity over the 20th century, about a third, roughly, on some calculations, just comes from this people moving to richer areas. And if you look in like the last 20-ish years, 30-ish years, you see this extremely steady process of income convergence as people move towards richer areas begin to throw itself into reverse. Because it used to make sense for the janitor and the lawyer to move to New York City. But now it only makes sense for the lawyer too, and the janitor leaves because you can't support yourself and your family and live in a home and have a reasonable commute being a janitor working in Manhattan. Now, obviously, some people do it, and it's often very tough, and they live very far. It's very hard in San Francisco. You can't look at cities as, well, that's just where the rich people are. And that's a problem that many Democrats now have. I mean, Michael Bloomberg famously just described New York City as a luxury good, and luxury goods cost luxury prices. And that's true in the sense that New York became a luxury good, but that's a problem. Like, that is a terrible problem and an inversion of what the city is. There's this famous advice, possibly apocryphally, from Horace Greeley, who's a kind of, early American newspaper publisher and political candidate. But he says, like, go west, young man, go west, right? The opportunity is out in the west where the lands are open. It's never been true, including for him. That guy moved from a rural area to New York City. And that's how he became famous. And he ran a newspaper, and he ran against Ulysses S. Grant in a presidential election. The cities are the frontier. The cities have always been the frontier, not of the land, but of the economy. Because the frontier of the economy is where ideas are produced. And ideas, even now, even in the age of remote work, are produced in the big cities where people live together. And they compete with each other, and they cooperate with each other. And so if you gate the cities, if you make it impossible for someone making $50,000 with 2 kids to live in the city, then what you've done is you've actually closed the American frontier. You have forced them into lower productivity places. Their children are less likely to grow up around, the sort of inventors in the cities. There's really amazing research from Ross Chetty and others, basically showing that kids, no matter what they are, no matter what income class they're in, they are likelier to grow up innovating and patenting in the innovations of the place around them. Right? Smart kids don't just grow up and innovate in anything. If they grow up in the Bay Area, they innovate in technology, as Steve Jobs did and Wozniak did, right? Because they just lived around those people. And that is true in many, many, many different things. And so when you gate the cities, housing is almost too small of a thing for what we're talking about. We're talking about if you can live next to economic opportunity. We are talking also about if you can put the people together who will create the next era of economic opportunity. Right now, the Bay Area is still in some ways drafting off of back when it was cheap. A lot of the people we're talking about who have made amazing things they started in the Bay Area when you could afford to live there. It wasn't always like this, and it wasn't that long ago that it wasn't like this. And now, fine, you can go there if you have money or you have a great job offer from Google or Apple or whomever. But over time, you need the ferment.
So in the end, Ezra didn't just answer Lex, he exposed the whole system. What started as a chat about housing turned into a brutal breakdown of how cities become walled-off playgrounds for the rich. And when he says cities are the real frontier, that hits hard. And Lex tried to steer the conversation, but honestly, he just sat there while Ezra just laid out the receipts. Redistribution, mobility, innovation, none of it works if you gate off opportunity. And when the gatekeeping just gets dressed up as natural economics, yeah, that's just bias in disguise. And speaking of bias,
are you getting tired of getting news from biased news sources? One outlet says one thing and another says the complete opposite? How are you supposed to know what's actually true? That's where ground news comes in. It lets you compare how different media outlets, whether it's left, right, or center, are covering the same story. So you can see the full picture instead of just the echo chamber. And here's the best part. Click the link in the description and get a 40% off the Vantage tier, which gives you even deeper insights in media bias and political trends. So stay informed, think for yourself, and check out ground news in the description down below.